You're watching Black the Vote Digital Housing Forum. My name is Katrina Holland, Executive Director of Community Alliance of Tenants.
And I'm Hannah Holloway, Policy Staff with the Urban League of Portland.
So as you know, there is a lot wrapped up in this November's election. Our values as Oregonians are on the ballot. The housing crisis continues to crumble our communities. And so a group of us Black-led organizations came together to have some real talk with candidates and with people in the know about some of the issues on the ballot. Issues like Black houselessness, issues like access to home ownership, renters, luxury units that are vacant while homeless people are sleeping on the streets. And so we really wanted a chance to dive in and ask some really tough questions. We hope that you'll learn a lot.
Also, a quick note, we as nonprofits take our C3 statuses very seriously. In that effort, we made every attempt to get all candidates to this forum. We made repeated phone calls, emails, moved our schedules and our formatting around in an effort to get everyone here. So the candidates that you will hear from are the candidates who were able to make time for this Black Housing Forum.
We hope that you enjoy. Feel free to share it, send it to your friends, send it to your family, ask tough questions, and make sure that you get out your vote on November 6th. Thank you for coming, JoAnn.
Absolutely my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Of course. Thanks for joining us. As you know, this is the Black the Vote Digital Housing Forum.
Yes.
And we're going to talk about Black houselessness, Black home ownership, and being a Black renter in the city of Portland and in Oregon. So we have a few questions to go through. Before we begin, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. I'm JoAnn Hardesty, and I'm running for Portland City Council Position 3, the seat currently held by Commissioner Dan Salzman.
Awesome. Great. Well, let's jump right into it.
Right.
How do you feel?
I'm ready.
Okay.
Let's go.
So let's talk a little bit about the Fair Housing Act. Given that the Fair Housing Act has now been weaponized against the Black community, and that the Equal Protection Clause has been used to say that it hinders race-explicit policy that would right some of the wrongs that have happened over several generations,
Yes.
how will you create policies to directly address disinvestment and exploitation of our communities?
We have seen this over and over and over again. We've seen plans that have explicitly said that African Americans would benefit, and there's been no assessment of the outcomes. When you look at the outcomes, you find out that we are worse off today than we were 30 years ago as a community.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's about holding people accountable to the outcomes we say we want.
Yeah.
It's about making sure we're setting policy that really explicitly addresses past wrongs. That's why I still have a hard time with the little spot of land across from the Urban League that's supposed to undo 35 years of discriminatory housing practices.
Yeah.
And then the procedure set up to allow people to move back in the inner Northeast
Yeah.
is race neutral.
Yeah.
Now, how do you address African Americans' homes being demolished, people being displaced from their community, and you develop a policy that's race neutral? How do you ever get there, right? How do you ever address the wrong? I think that it's a pretend effort because, again, if you're not using race as a criteria to determine who gets access to come back, whether it's home ownership, whether it's rental assistance, then you're not directly confronting the racist past of Oregon and Oregon housing policy.
And so you plan to...
And so I plan to evaluate the policies that we have in place and make sure that they do what we intend them to do.
Right.
You know, equity is the new buzzword at the City of Portland.
Yep. It is.
And it means just what affirmative action meant and inclusion meant and all the other buzzwords. Every 10 years we have a new one. But at the end of the day, for me, it's all about outcomes, it is all about measurements, and it's all about making sure that we're actually living to our objectives.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. So what role should the government play, the City of Portland play, in rectifying state-sanctioned efforts that denied Black Oregonians home ownership opportunities? Given the weaponization of those efforts against Black Portlanders, how should the city repair the lost wealth that the Black community would have gained?
You know, that is a great question. And I hope that after I'm elected, that CATS members and others who have been really focused on this issue for a long time will really work with me to help develop a policy that's very intentional. What I will say is that I will stop immediately any kind of incentives for folks who pretend that they're doing what we want and have never ever had those outcomes. We should be ensuring that African Americans are building the homes. We should assure that they have the opportunity to purchase the homes. And we should be making sure that people have the opportunity to stay in their communities and build community where they are, right? Since I've lived here, January 1st, 1990, I have seen the African American community be disinvested in over and over and over again. You may know that between 2000 and 2010, when 10,000 African American
Mass
people
exodus.
were displaced, were pushed out of inner Northeast Portland, nobody called that a housing crisis, right?
Yeah.
We didn't have mayors standing up saying, we got to do something, right? Not a peep from our elected leaders. When white middle-class families could no longer afford to live in the city of Portland, we've had 2 mayors now declare a housing emergency. But they're still operating as if we've got all the time in the world. And they still are working with the same development partners that actually created the disparity in the first place. And they have not actually come up with a plan to really supercharge making sure that we have enough housing at every income level in every neighborhood.
Right. So given the likelihood that the new commissioner will not get the Housing Bureau
Right.
since it's under the mayor, what policies or decision-making strategies will you introduce with the bureaus you are assigned
Yes.
to improve housing in Portland?
Well, let me just say that I won't work in a box, so the silo boxes of who gets assigned what, because people in this community don't live in boxes. They don't live in silos, right? And so I will have the Fire Bureau, I'll have the 911 call center, I'll have the emergency management system office, and I love it because I will have the other parts of our public safety system right away. I want to embed mental health professionals in our call center so that when somebody calls and says somebody's got a mental health issue, a mental health professional triages that call and sends the right first responders. We cannot allow it to be normal that when you send a first responder for someone who's suffering a mental health issue, that they get killed, and we say nobody did anything wrong.
Yeah.
That cannot become a standard in our community, right?
Right.
And so for me, I will work with my bureaus to make sure that they are implementing policy that moves forward a just agenda. For the bills that I don't have, it doesn't mean I won't be involved.
Right.
Just like Commissioner Chloe Udaly, she's never had housing, but every tenant protection that's come out of City Hall in the last 2 years started in her office.
Yeah.
And so I will be a good partner with her to make sure that as we're developing tenant protections, that we're making sure that the most vulnerable in our community are not being priced out more.
Yeah. Okay.
I could go on, but I'm sure you have other questions.
We do. But this is your time. So
Right,
if you want to
okay.
go on, feel free to
Okay.
go on. So let's talk numbers.
Okay.
Like let's have the
All
real
right,
real.
Let's have the real.
So black folks are about 6% of Portland's population. But we're 16% of the houseless population, according to the 2017 point in time count. With a 48% increase in 2 years.
Yes. 48% increase?
48% increase in 2 years than the previous count. So what city policies and ordinances will you introduce to eliminate these significant racial disparities in the houseless population in particular?
Well, I think it's not rocket science. When you think about how the criminal justice system works in Portland, when you think about having a gang enforcement unit that has 28 officers who don't answer calls, don't back up officers in need, their whole job is to go out and intervene in gang activity. 28 officers full-time with all the overtime they want. They are not good at their job. 54% of their stops in 2016 were of African Americans. So even if you believe the police that gang activity happens between 12 and 24, we don't have enough black 12 to 24-year-olds to justify 54% of the gang stops being of African American people. It just doesn't make sense. The fact that we have a city council that has no intellectual curiosity as to why that number is so enormous is troubling. The auditor is the one who did the study and came out with the data. And what the audit shows is that police have no criteria. they lied to the public because they said they weren't keeping gang lists anymore. And guess what? The auditor found a very intensive gang list. And they found two. They found a super gangster list that changes every 30 days with the top 100 gangsters, but with no criteria to determine how you get on the super gangster list. And so what we have are 28 men and women who are self-select who they stop, who they search, who they try to criminalize. And out of all those stops, 13% led to some kind of prosecution. And Portland Police Gang Enforcement Unit couldn't tell us how many of that 13% actually were involved in gang activity. And so I want to do away with the unit.
Yeah.
And because they're not good at what they do.
Right.
They actually fail miserably, and they have no supervision and no accountability for what they do.
Yeah.
So for me, get rid of the gang enforcement unit, put those 28 officers in a retraining, because we certainly don't want them on the street interacting with other community members until they've been retrained.
Right. You mean the houseless population?
With the houses pop,
Yeah.
exactly, right? What we know is last year, 54% of Portland police arrests were of people, but for being houseless, would have never, ever, ever encountered the criminal justice system. What we know from Multnomah counties, and I'm forgetting the name of the report right now, but a couple of years ago, the Portland Tribune did a series that was entitled "The High Cost of Being Black in Multnomah County," and it showed that at every step of the way in the criminal justice system, African Americans have much more severe outcomes. So, for example, African Americans get charged 50% more with spitting on the sidewalk. I didn't know that was a crime.
Wow.
I didn't know you could actually go to. I thought they would laugh you out of the courtroom if you brought somebody in for spitting on the sidewalk.
Wow.
But apparently, if you're black and you spit on the sidewalk, the punishment is more severe, the penalty is more severe, and you get prosecuted. I would think the DAs would laugh you out of the office, right? We're going to prosecute you, right? And so that's how we've criminalized populations, which means they end up on the street, right? So you end up incarcerated, then you end up on the street because now you can't rent, right? Because you got this criminal thing on your record, right? And so the cycle continues, right? And so we have to stop criminalizing people for being poor, and we have to create economic opportunities so people can work their way out of poverty. And so one of the things I've done is create the Portland Clean Energy Fund Initiative, which I'm so proud of, which is on the same ballot as I'm on. It taxes large retail operations, increases their business income tax by 1%, and creates a pool around $30 to $35 million annually that will be invested in climate mitigation and green job development, prioritizing communities of color who've been left out of the economic engine. I am so proud that we put this initiative together, collected 66,000 signatures, and we led with race very intentionally. These are the people that aren't thriving in this economic boom, right? And we have an obligation to both address climate issues as well as make sure that people of color are not being left further and further behind.
Right. Okay. So let's talk about, in 2017 American Community Survey data just came out. It didn't go specifically to the city level, but it talked about the state level.
Okay.
And it basically showed that 64% of African Americans in Oregon are renters.
Oh, not surprised.
What's going on here? How do you plan to address that so we move to a more equitable path in Portland? Because I imagine that a lot of them are important because a lot of us are in Portland.
Right, right. Well, we have a history of housing segregation and tearing down home ownership, homes that African Americans own, right? You think about every major development that's happened in Portland, it's happened on the back of the African American community, right? Whether it was Emmanuel, whether it was the freeway expansion, whether it was Memorial Coliseum, every single big development, urban renewal development, was on the back of the African American community. And city policy actually made it worse, right? And so for me, it's a matter of going back and reviewing what we have on the books, because again, the city comes up with very flowery language that sounds like on paper that this should benefit those who have been left behind, right? So why is it at the other end, when you count, you find out that there's been no benefit? We have to actually have more inspectors to make sure that renters are not being denied inappropriately. I remember a couple of years ago when the city of Portland actually sent testers out to rent apartments.
Fair housing testing,
Fair,
yeah.
right, fair housing testing, and they didn't like the results, so they didn't release the report. Because the report showed that African Americans and Latinos and people with small children were being discriminated against on an ongoing basis, right? There was some thought that the training that landlords got taught them how to not be sued for denying people housing, right? I know that Commissioner Udaley's office is now working on changing the application process for how people actually become renters in the first place, how they move into an apartment. We know that sometimes people's backgrounds actually prevent them from being able to get into housing. We know that apartment owners want people to have 3 times the income in order to rent a property. And so in a place like Oregon today, where the median income is $72,500, when I hear people say, well, we're building housing at 30% of the median income. Well, I don't know too many people making $50,000 a year. So they're still building for housing that's not going to address the inequality of people at the low end of the housing spectrum, right? Which is why I've been so opposed to investing money in Wapato, right? What we need to invest money in is permanent affordable housing, right? And actually, I don't even like the term affordable housing anymore. I now like to say housing that people can afford to live in. Because I can't tell you what's affordable for you, and you can't tell me what's affordable for me. But if I say to you, you need this much income to live in this house, you can decide whether or not that's affordable. We've had many home ownership programs to support African American home ownership. The latest one with this city project about bringing people back has been a total failure, an absolute failure. In 3 years, I think they've got 2 people in the home ownership opportunities, right? Something's wrong with that. But the city does a masterful job of that over and over and over again. Put these little groups together and you say, oh yeah, we're gonna undo all 30 years of discrimination, right? Watch us. And they don't. And then there's no accountability. If you're not doing it, then clearly that's not the process that's gonna make it happen, right? I think what I bring to the city council that will be unique is I am a grassroots organizer, right? So if I'm trying to get a policy passed, it's just not me going to my colleagues, right? I'm talking to the community. I'm bringing the community into the conversation early, and I'm making sure that you show up when we have this conversation at City Council, right? Because I know how to pack City Council chambers. And the first thing I want to do is open up the balcony, because how disrespectful to the public who comes down to testify that they can't even get into the chamber because people are concerned about people being disruptive. Right?
Yeah.
So there's so much to fix.
Yeah.
I don't want to walk in with preconceived ideas of what the appropriate policy is, because I know this much about the internal operation now. But the more I learn, the more I realize that our internal safety nets are broken,
Yeah.
right? They don't exist anymore. And so one illness, one car breaking down, one loss of a job. There used to be a little bit of wiggle room. Now you just fall right through.
Homelessness.
Boom.
Yeah. So accessing housing, both in the private market with social services supports, has been relatively difficult for Black Portlanders. You talked a little bit about this with the
Yes.
fair housing testing due to screening criteria
Yes.
and security deposit
Yes.
barriers. So if for some reason the current reform proposal that's happening right now in City Council pushes into your timeline as City Commissioner, if you're elected, do you plan
When?
to push right when do you plan to push these reforms forward? And what would you like to see different about the policy?
What I'd like to see different about the policy is that the people most impacted by the policy are at the table helping develop the policy. I think one of the challenges has been, as I've been out talking to people, that a lot of people feel like things are being done to them rather than being done with them. And so I want to make sure that we have talked to renters, we've talked to houseless people, we've talked to developers, we've talked to small apartment owners, we've talked to everybody, and everybody's at the table helping to develop the policy. I don't think you can develop it in isolation. As I talk to apartment owners, and they all think they're small apartment owners, right? But say 40 or less apartments in their unit. they absolutely feel like that they've become the boogeyman in the city of Portland. And I actually want them to be partners and actually helping to make sure we have housing at every income level in every neighborhood, right? And I think there's some barriers that we can remove for them. For example, in our housing emergency, it takes much longer today to get permits than it did before the housing emergency was declared. If we have people who have wonderful, wonderful projects, especially that benefit the neediest people in our community, say Black vets as an example, we should be eliminating systems development fees for those properties. We should be fast tracking the permitting process. If we're doing something that we know we desperately need, we should be removing barriers for that to happen. Instead, it appears that the city of Portland is putting more barriers in place that actually exacerbates the housing crisis.
Okay, thank you. So a recent report concluded that there are significant vacancies right now.
16,000.
16,000
Yes.
in luxury housing market.
Yes.
While rents continue to go up for the core and the lower ends of the market.
Yes.
Meanwhile, I think the recent count was 4,000 something people were sleeping on the streets.
That's right.
And as we talked about earlier, many of those families are members of our community.
That's
So
right.
Significant overrepresentation.
That's right. And I will say our houseless population is pretty invisible. Because what we do is sleep on our cousin's couch, right?
Right.
What we do is sleep in the garage. What we do is make room, right, for people who are struggling, right? And so it exacerbates how horrible the problem is because most of it's invisible.
Or undercounted,
Or
yeah.
and undercounted, right?
Yeah.
Because of course we don't tell government our business, right?
Right.
That's just not how we roll.
Right.
And so it is very troubling to think that we have 16,000 apartment complexes that are empty
Yeah.
because we've been on this building boom where 85% of the construction are for luxury units.
Yeah.
For people who don't live here yet.
So how do we fix this?
Well, I mean, I think it will fix itself within the next 2 years because we are starting to go to an economic downturn. Those buildings will be in foreclosure. And we will have housing bond money from the Metro Housing Bond to be able to buy up some of those properties very cheap. But we have to do more now. The sad thing is there are 5 years of building permits already issued, right? And so when people say to me, well, can't you just stop the luxury building? Not if 5 years of permits are already on the street.
Right.
What we can do is expedite low-income and middle-income housing permits. We could do that, right? And we could figure out why the heck, what is wrong in the permitting bureau that it takes so long to do things in an emergency, right?
Yeah.
Because if it's an emergency, you would think that we wouldn't be using the status quo. This is the way we've always done it, right? We'd be innovative. We'd be saying, well, wait a minute, let's try this, right? Let's try that. And give you a great example. On 117th and right around 117th off of Halsey, is a beauty shop. And the husband and wife team who've owned the beauty shop for almost 30 years are within 5 years of retiring. I met him at Sailors when I was waiting for my to-go order. And just happened to start this casual conversation. And he tells me he owns 4 apartment complexes. They're all 10 units or less. And he's owned them for like 20 plus years. And they bought it with the intent that was their retirement nest egg, right? So they're 5 years from retirement. And I said to him, well, would you be interested in selling your apartments to the city of Portland? Because we have this housing emergency and we want to keep affordable apartments affordable. And he was like, I could do that. And I said, well, yeah, we got this housing bond and blah, 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 right? The problem with the Housing Bureau is they're not operating like it's an emergency. They haven't left City Hall, right? They need to be out in the neighborhood talking to people. They need to be out talking to seniors who bought their homes 30 years ago for $20,000, $30,000 and are 5 years from retirement. Their kids live out of town, right? They're trying to think, what are my last days going to be like, right? There's still working class neighborhoods where we could go in and buy up the working class neighborhood and give people a fair return on their money. I'm very concerned what's happening today is seniors are being gouged out of their properties, right? Somebody's walking in waving $100,000 and it's like, well, if I bought it for $20,000, they're going to give me $100,000. Oh, that's a deal, right?
Right.
Not knowing that they're going to just sell it again for $500,000, right?
Right.
Or tear it down and build, 500 apartments in its place.
Right.
The city has an obligation, a housing bureau, to actually change how they operate, right? The fact that Holgate Manor was bought by a California investor before Portland Housing Bureau knew that those 72 apartment complexes were going to be available because the owner died, that's appalling.
Yeah.
People should be losing their job if they're not operating as if we're in an emergency.
Yeah. So I'm curious to know, we've talked a little bit about the government. What do you feel, last part of the question, what role do you feel the private market plays in remedying this problem?
Well, we keep pretending that, market forces are like this, inevitable force that just kind of works on its own. I think the government's role is to incentivize private developers to build housing at every income level, right? Rather than building the most expensive units they can build and charge the most they can charge. For example, it's amazing to me that we haven't done a better job of just prioritizing housing that people can afford to live in, right? So if you're talking about people who work full time, and many people work 2 and 3 jobs, but still can't afford first, last security deposit, and pet rent to live in the city of Portland, it's the city's job to remove barriers so that working people can afford to live in a city that they live in.
Yeah.
So, but I will say that it's not just Portland by itself. This is a regional issue.
Yeah.
And so working with our regional elected leaders, like working with TriMet, I believe that public transit should be built based on the people who need it most. And it should be free, right? Period. If we're going to ever reach our climate justice goals, we have to get people out of automobiles. If we're going to reduce auto emissions, people have to drive less, right?
Right.
But we have to make sure that public transit and other kind of transportation opportunities exist in every community, right? I use the example of today in East Portland, we get butt cheek lanes at the bus stop, no rain shelter, right? You got that steel grate, and you can put one butt cheek up against it while you wait for the bus. You walk in, you go in the inner Northeast now,
Yeah.
they've got these big, beautiful bus
Benches,
shelters. 8 people could sit in it. There's cover from the rain, and no one is ever at the bus stops. Right? And I asked the TriMet manager, so who decided that we got butt cheek lanes and they got these fully functional covers in the rain? Where does that decision happen, right? And so my philosophy is if you're not at the table, you're at lunch.
You're on
right?
the menu.
You're on the menu, right?
Yeah.
And so we have to ask those questions to TriMet. I have no responsibility for their budget, but the fact that they cover Multnomah, Washington, and Clackamas County, I have an obligation to move them as well.
Yeah.
Which is why I'm happy that Lynn Peterson, the incoming Metro president, supports my campaign.
That's awesome.
Because we have to do this regionally. Portland won't solve the housing crisis, the transportation infrastructure problem by itself.
Yeah.
If we don't have a regional vision and we're not bringing the region with us, I think our biggest challenge is we've had so many one-term mayors. There's no vision for where Portland's headed.
Yeah.
Right? And so we need leadership that actually has a clear vision that's inclusive of everyone, which is why my campaign has been about one Portland, a Portland that works for all of us, right? But I don't have rose-colored glasses. I'm not going in thinking I'm going to wave a magic wand and like
everything's
that.
gonna be
Everything's
fixed,
going to
yeah.
be fine, right? I know that there's some entrenched special interests that have always gotten their way because there have not been people like me sitting on the city council. And so I look forward to removing those barriers so that when we say that we have equitable outcomes, we're not like hiding it, right? We
Yeah.
can say, here's how African Americans benefited, here's how Latinos benefited, here's how women benefited,
Yeah.
right? Because I have to force that answer at City Council today,
Yeah.
right? Because they like to put minority women and emerging small businesses in one fell swoop so that you don't actually see the real numbers.
Right.
And when you see the real numbers, you find out African Americans benefit least, right?
So let's talk a little bit about the state.
Okay.
We've talked about this a little bit before, that there's a proposal coming in 2019 to address rent stabilization, out of control rent increases.
Right,
I think
right.
we just had a candidate in here who explained that a family, person that he knows, received a 300% rent increase. So
I
let's.
thought that was illegal, or it must not be in the city of Portland.
It wasn't in the city
Okay,
of Portland.
all right.
But in the city
could
of
be.
Portland, there was a Southwest family that received a 350% rent increase within, I think, a couple of months, and they obviously moved because they couldn't afford it.
Right.
So let's say the state either implements rent stabilization for all cities within the state of Oregon,
Right.
or says cities can do what they want. Would you push forward a rent stabilization policy?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And surprise, surprise, I've had lots of pushback from developers and apartment rental owners. And I say, it is a tool. It's not the only tool, but it is a tool that we need to make sure that people who work, worship, go to school in Portland are able to live in a city that they work, go to school, and worship in. Right? We have an obligation to make sure that people who, can have the quality of life that they're working to have. Right. And I've said this everywhere. Some places I thought they were going to throw things at me. Right.
Yeah.
And I will be one of the strong public leaders that will be going to Salem to testify with people in order to make sure that we have rent stabilization. And I've made this offer to developers and apartment owners. Come up with a better idea, I'm willing to listen to it. Right?
Right.
But for the moment, what I see is a lot of suffering and a lot of fear. People are fearful of the next rent increase. People are fearful of people living on the street outside their homes. People are fearful of how they're going to be able to enjoy their city when they see so many people who are suffering, right? Who just don't have the economic means to get one leg up.
Right.
And quite frankly, I have no hesitation about saying rent stabilization is one tool in our toolbox.
Yeah.
Right?
And what about just cause evictions? So another thing, people get no cause evictions, especially as a screen for retaliation
Yes.
or discrimination in our
Right.
community.
Right.
I know on our hotline it's a pretty big issue. It comes up quite a bit. Would you support a just cause standard that says no more no cause eviction? There has to be a reason that
Yes.
somebody's getting evicted.
Yes, I would. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Because again, I mean, it's like what I know is that it's much more cost effective to keep someone in the home they have now than it is to try to help them find another home. Right?
Right.
And so, yes, I mean, again, because we all have to be part of solving the housing crisis that we're in right now. And I think, so the owners of those buildings have to have some skin in the game, right? The people who are renters have to have some skin in the game, right? And if we're doing the right thing, right, and you're paying your rent on time and you're not causing problems, just because you want to be able to increase the rent so that you get more profit, I don't think it's a good reason to kick people out.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're
Well, that wraps up the questions for today. Is there anything you'd like to close out with? Thank you for participating.
It's absolutely been my pleasure. I will say that when I started this journey, I started it because I was mad. I was angry that I had been banging my head on the walls of City Hall for so long, right? And so when I decided to run, I wanted to make sure that I was running to represent regular people, right? And I just want to say we're, 13 days away from Election Day, and I'm so proud of the team I've built, and I'm proud of the work that we've done, right? Because I have been authentic to who I am, and people see that, right? That's the same skills I'll bring to City Hall. When I was a legislator, I didn't change. I was still a community organizer, I was still a grassroots person, and I will bring that same grassroots philosophy to City Hall, right? Because some things we do just don't make sense, right? And common sense is just not as common at City Hall as I would have hoped, right? But I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to hard conversations and hard choices because we don't have an unlimited amount of money. But I'm also looking forward to making sure that the community is a part of that decision-making process. As you know, I'm planning to have meetings out in the community because I don't think you should have to come downtown, sit for 2 hours, and wait for your 2 to 3 minutes of public testimony to have your voice heard. I think we should be coming out into the communities in the evenings when people are free to come and participate, and then having that deep dialogue and conversation. It's amazing what we could do together, but what we end up doing as a city is trying to divide and conquer people, right? So if we could just put you in this box, you're just, a renter advocate, right? Or you're just a police accountability advocate, right? If we can put people in boxes, then we don't have to deal with the whole, right?
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to dealing with the whole.
Great.
And
Thank
having
you.
your help in making that happen.
We're happy to help. Thanks so much for your
Thank
time
you.
today. Really appreciate the
I greatly
interview.
appreciate it.